to Bob Dyer and Bill Brumke. I don't know how you
Bill, you
gentlemen
want to go first?
how you want to handle that.
Sure. I can jump out front because what we do, of course, is the first step of a lengthy budget process, and our budget feeds into Bobby's budget. So maybe it would be best if we kind of just talk about some of ours first. In the past, we've had the opportunity, I really appreciate being able to be out here again. I'm sorry if there was some form of miscommunication and who was going to be here, wasn't going to be here, but I'm happy to be here. Y'all know I'm not a PowerPoint guy. I don't really like the whole thing, so I really like having a conversation. But I brought out a couple sheets of paper that are really just some very high-level overviews of where we are. I'm just going to ask you if you could just take half and just kind of spread it each way. Just spread some of these around. Just spread those around. This year, our budget is relatively benign. You know, in past years, there's been lots and lots of discussions about these different pieces of the revenue side and expense side flowing around. There's been a lot of discussion about different things that have been going on. And this year, when you look at these sheets, when you look at our revenues and the expenditures we have, there's basically not much movement in terms of our overall budget from last year to this year. The most, we have some increase. We have some increase coming from the state, some additional revenues that have come from the state, about $11 million. Those revenues that are coming from the state are primarily driven by some additional K-3 classroom size initiatives at the state level. Those initiatives are designed to decrease class size for the lower grade levels. Other than that, there is no additional state funding for compensation. The increases that you see are driven by K-3 initiatives, and also I'll add some increase in staff due to enrollment increases. We had a small uptick in enrollment this year, a few hundred students add up to a couple dozen teachers. So those two items, K-3 initiatives, an increase in enrollment, flow through the state and come down to us in the form of increased basic aid. That's the $11 million. In the current budget, there is zero budgeted for actual increases in compensation for existing employees. We can talk a little bit later. There is, in the second year of the budget up at the state, some ideas and some numbers in there for a second year. But for the 2014-15 school year, there is no increase in compensation. So, when we get to the expense side and we look at personnel increase costs, that cost is being fully funded locally. We'll talk in a minute about what that means. The second piece that's being increased on the revenue side is from our local government. That is driven primarily by the formula that we have, and we talked about the formula at length in the previous years, and looking around, I think most of y'all were here for a lot of those discussions. Those increases that we see from the state, though, are almost entirely real estate tax driven. I'll let Mr. Dyer speak to the particulars of that. But through the funding formula and the funds that come into the city, that's what ultimately flows to us. When we prepared our original estimate of needs, we were not anticipating that. We had originally budgeted some smaller numbers in terms of compensation. We have directed the majority of those new revenues towards compensation. Currently, I'm going to flip over to the expense side, and I don't have it in front of me, but I remember them. On the expense side, we have two basic areas where you see increases. One, in compensation. That compensation increase you see is a 2.79% increase in compensation, reduced by 1% that's going back to VRS. Just as a refresher, over the past several years, for new employees and existing employees on a phased-in basis, there is a requirement that the employee contribute, when we're done with the phase-in, 5% of their compensation to VRS. Quasi, I'll use the term 401k, but it's not technically, so let's not call it that. But it's that type of model where there's an employee contribution to VRS. When it's completely phased in, it will be 5% of compensation. And we're in the process of phasing that in now through a 5-year period. We're doing 1% per year. So that compensation increase, the dollars that you see there, when I say 2.79%, keep in mind that on a net basis, that's actually 1.79% to the employees, because that 1%, in terms of their take-home pay, 1% is going back to VRS. The biggest number you see on the expense side of the page in terms of increase from year to year are fringe benefits. I think it's 11,000,007. Is that the number I have? 11.7?
Yeah.
11.1. That is driven most significantly by VRS and adjustments that are made to the contribution rate that the city, or the schools in this case, pays to VRS as a percentage of compensation. The rate of contribution that we were provided increased this year. The other very significant piece is employee health care. If there's been one issue that seems to have taken over the public discussion, it's been employee health care. And I understand why. Because it's something that hits closest to home for each and every employee of the city when we have this discussion. But I'm going to hand out another sheet of paper in a moment that's really going to illustrate the employee health care discussion and kind of put it in what I believe some context that it should be placed. In terms of overall dollars, that's the big picture for our school budget. There's not a lot going on this year. We don't have a long list of $75 million of items that are being cut from school, middle school transportation and sports and all of those things. We have provided some nominal compensation adjustments for our employees. There are a couple other things going on in the budget that kind of get lost if you look at the big picture budget, but I think they're important things to point out, and I wanted to bring them to your attention. One of the things we did is we eliminated a program called Project Exceed. Project Exceed is a middle school program that costs $1.6 million. It was focused on middle school students, grades 6, 7, and 8, and it significantly reduced class size for those students in targeted schools. It was in place in 3 schools. It served a total of 300 middle school students. Just in terms of average numbers, to give you some context, each grade level has about 5,000 students. So out of 15,000 students, this was serving 300 students. What we always do with every program in the school system is we're constantly evaluating the long-term effect and following the students through our school system who have been impacted or influenced by the various programs and resources we have in place. And one thing that became clear, while there were individual stories of success for individual students, and we certainly heard about those individual stories of success, as a long-term, as a group in its entirety, that group of students, by the time they got into high school, was no different than their peer group, their cohorts, those students who had similar socioeconomic challenges, those students who were similarly 2 grade levels behind in reading when entering 6th grade but couldn't participate in the program. So we developed groups of cohorts when doing this evaluation and watch those students progress. And when those students get into 9th grade and 10th grade, what you start to realize is there was really no difference in the performance of those students who had been through this program and those students who hadn't. And the other argument was for the program was it would help with graduation rates for the students because they've developed another level of support at middle school. And unfortunately, it didn't. By the time we got to high school, the graduation rates were actually lower. I don't think it's lower as a result of the program, but I think what it did say clearly was the program didn't have the midterm or long-term impacts that it was intended to have. And something we're not afraid to do at the school board is just because something's in place doesn't mean it has to be in place because that's the way it always was. So we cut that program. Did I receive a lot of emails from folks? I did, because there were individual success stories. Now, whether or not the success of that individual story was a result of this program or other circumstances and they happen to participate in the program, I can't answer that. But what I can tell you is, as a group, it wasn't successful. We talked last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago, about kindergarten, full-day kindergarten. Y'all know I'm a cynic when it comes to full-day kindergarten. I view it differently than others. But there are some folks who would really like to see Virginia Beach have full-day kindergarten. Why? Well, because everybody else does it. And the fact of the matter is, it's terribly expensive. So we have to ask ourselves, what benefits do we receive from full-day kindergarten? First of all, just in terms of cost, it's about $12 million a year. So, again, in terms of evaluation...
Over and above what we're paying now for kindergarten?
Yes, sir. It would be a $12 million increase in our cost to expand our current kindergarten. So, what we have to do, and this is my approach, I look at what we're trying to accomplish and what are we trying to do. Of course, we're trying to provide our youngest students academic support and access. So we have to look at, well, what do we already have? We already have Title I schools. Title I schools provide full-day kindergarten to students. We're not paying for that. That's a federal program that's paying for that. Number two, we have something called EDK, Extended Day Kindergarten. Not a full-day program, but it's an extended day program where they're entirely focused on kindergarten appropriate literacy. And one thing that we do, again, is we take data, we track data. So we asked before we jumped off this ledge if we have to do full-day kindergarten because it must be good because everybody's doing it. And the data will show you, that the analysis shows you that by the time you get to third grade, the benefits in our own school system, forget about other experiences that other school systems have, which will also be similar if you're willing to read those. In our own school system, we tracked our own students in a similar manner as I discussed earlier for middle school students. And by the time you get to third grade, any benefit that was received from full-day kindergarten, and there were benefits during the course of that kindergarten year for those students, but by third grade, we were all back in the same playing field. So what we did, and this is a long-winded explanation to say, we eliminated Project Exceed. We recognized that there were benefits from the early interventions in kindergarten, but in fact, there was no staying power to those, and by third grade, they were all the same. We really want to, and my suggestion was that we evaluate what are we doing in first and second grade from a literacy standpoint that can help support the needs of these students. So one of the things we did was expand some literacy initiatives in first and second grade this year. Those have budget impacts. Those budget impacts are approximately the $1.6 million that we traded with Project Exceed. We're reallocating those resources because we said what we were doing wasn't working. These students still have needs. Those kids that are in sixth grade, that are 2 grade levels behind, that don't have any of the traditional support that maybe we have at home. They're kids and they still need some level of support. So we've reallocated. And again, we're not afraid to do those things at the school board. We do it regularly. One other comment about our budget, and then I'm going to go to healthcare, and I'm going to just surface level, because I think that's a much bigger issue that you and I can address together, Bobby. And I mentioned this to anybody who will listen, and I know I have all of your attention. We got a budget document that's over here. By the time you add it up, it's about this thick. And it's got CIP and all this other stuff. Oh, by the way, I didn't say anything about CIP because it's exactly the same as last year. There's no real change in our CIP initiatives. buried underneath all of those numbers is one very disturbing number. That's, yes, disturbing for our school system, but more disturbing for our community. And that is, since 2008, we have seen a 40% increase in free and reduced lunch. 40% increase in free and reduced lunch.
Total student population percentage-wise?
60, I think we're at 38% total is where we are, but we have a 40% increase in free and reduced lunch since 2005.
This goes to the summer too, correct?
Pardon me?
Some of it goes to the summer too, is that correct?
Summer, I'm sure I'm not understanding the question.
Summer months, so some of that is happening also, right?
The free and reduced, yeah, there are a number of lunch programs, and that's another, we could have a whole discussion about the nutrition initiatives in the school system. But yeah, there are ripple effects. I'm referencing that more from the standpoint of the stress on our community. We have 24 of our schools have greater than 50% free and reduced lunch. How many schools is 24? We have 86 total. So about a third of our schools have more than half of their kids living at a level that is generally accepted as near poverty. We have 744 students. May not sound like a lot, but it's 744 students. More than 1% of our student population is homeless. Those are little numbers that are just kind of little footnotes in our budget. And there are budgetary impacts to that. Don't misunderstand me. We have Bayside Middle School is an area where there's a $1.6 million budgetary impact this year to address the very distressed nature of Bayside Middle School, which is now going to be split. There's going to be a 6th grade campus and a 7th and 8th grade campus. And we have some serious issues in that community that have to be addressed. Something I say often is we don't have failing schools in Virginia Beach. I think we have tremendously successful schools. I think we have teachers and staff and support staff that have an incredible commitment to the kids of this community. But at the end of the day, these characteristics of our school, they're a reflection of our community. In the long term, Bayside Middle School and some of the issues that we have to address in Bayside Middle School are the tip of the iceberg. And there are significant financial implications to that. Because the level of support and need that these students have goes beyond what we currently do. One grade, one school is over $1.5 million to address the issues there. Now, why is that? Because the school is not accredited. And the state has gotten to the point, and we've moved through with Bayside Middle School, the levels of intervention locally that the state has stepped in and said, these are the things that you are going to have to do in this school. And we want to see a plan to address these things. And they're not, let me tweak this and tweak that. These are significant things. And we can have another conversation another day. This is about budgets today. But I point that out because those are, in my opinion, the real drivers in this budget that aren't showing up on those sheets of paper right now. But 10 years from now, 15 years from now, those numbers are going to drive, those things are going to drive these numbers. I'm going to segue to healthcare just for a second because it's probably the biggest piece. And again, this is really a joint issue. And I start off by saying that in order to really appreciate the healthcare discussion that we're having here, we need to understand that we are not negotiating premiums with a third-party insurer. We are a